You've met the obvious narcissist, the one who talks over you, brags about their accomplishments, needs to be the loudest person in the room. That type is easy to spot once you know what you're looking at. You can protect yourself from something you can see. But there's another type, one that presents as the opposite of that. Quiet, self-deprecating, often the person in the room who seems most considerate of others. This type doesn't announce itself with arrogance. It approaches you with vulnerability. And by the time you recognize what's actually happening, you've already been inside the relationship for months or years, wondering why you feel worse about yourself than you ever have before. This is the covert narcissist, the secret narcissist. And the psychology behind how they operate is significantly darker than most people want to believe. The fundamental difference. Clinical psychology distinguishes between two primary narcissistic presentations. The grandiose type, loud, entitled, obviously self-centered, and the covert type, also called vulnerable narcissism. Both share the same core features: an inflated self-concept, a chronic need for admiration, and an absence of genuine empathy. The mechanism is identical. What differs is the strategy. The grandiose narcissist demands attention. The covert narcissist engineers it. Where the grandiose type says, "Look how exceptional I am," the covert type performs suffering until you look at them. Where the grandiose type takes credit openly, the covert type positions themselves as overlooked, underappreciated, constantly failed by others, and waits for you to correct that narrative. This is not a less severe form of narcissism. Research on vulnerable narcissism consistently finds elevated levels of emotional dysregulation, chronic resentment, and interpersonal manipulation compared to the grandiose presentation. The covert narcissist is more likely to cause long-term psychological damage to the people in their lives, specifically because they're so much harder to identify. You don't protect yourself from a threat you can't name. The vulnerability mask. The entry point into a relationship with a covert narcissist almost always looks like emotional intimacy. They open with vulnerability. They tell you about their difficult childhood, their history of being mistreated, the people who failed to see how exceptional they are. It feels like trust. It feels like the kind of emotional honesty most people never offer. You feel honored by it. You feel seen. You feel uniquely qualified to understand them in a way no one else has. What you're actually watching is a performance, and it has a specific psychological function. When someone shares suffering with you early and intensely, it activates your attachment system. It creates a sense of mutual investment. You've been let in. You're now, implicitly, responsible for not becoming another person who fails them. The vulnerability mask accomplishes three things simultaneously. It makes the covert narcissist appear sensitive and emotionally aware, the opposite of what you'd expect from a narcissist. It positions them as a victim from the first moment of contact, which preemptively neutralizes any future criticism you might raise. And it creates obligation. You entered the relationship as the person who finally understood them. Leaving means becoming the newest entry in the long list of people who let them down. None of this is consciously orchestrated in most cases. It's a pattern so deeply embedded in how they relate to the world that it operates automatically. But the effect is the same regardless of whether it's deliberate. Victimhood as control. Once the relationship is established, the covert narcissist's primary instrument of control is the victim identity. Every conflict routes back to their suffering. Every time you raise a concern, the conversation inverts. You came in to address something they did. You leave the conversation apologizing for how you addressed it. The original issue, what they actually did, never gets examined. You're too busy defending your tone, your timing, your intentions. This pattern has a name in psychological literature. DARVO. Deny, attack, reverse victim, and offender. The covert narcissist didn't start this technique intentionally, but they've used it so consistently throughout their life that it's reflexive. Any threat to their self-image, which is what your criticism represents, triggers an immediate defensive inversion. They become the one who was hurt by the conversation. Over time, you learn what this means. You learn to manage how you raise issues. You soften your approach. You choose your timing carefully. You preface your concern with reassurances. You're spending enormous psychological energy preparing to have a basic conversation about something that bothered you. And even with all that preparation, the odds are high that the conversation still won't go the way you planned. This is not a communication problem. It's a control mechanism. Every time you modify your behavior to prevent their reaction, they've successfully conditioned you to make them the center of the interaction, even when you're the one who was hurt. The subtle arsenal. The covert narcissist rarely attacks directly. The methods are quieter than that, and they work precisely because of their quietness. Each one can be individually dismissed as a misread or an accident. The pattern they form is something else. Backhanded compliments. I love how you don't care what people think about how you look. You're so brave for pursuing that, even though it probably won't go anywhere. These statements land wrong. You can feel it. But the delivery is warm, the framing is positive, and when you try to articulate what bothered you, you sound hypersensitive. This is by design. The comment accomplishes its purpose, a small reduction in your confidence, without any accountability. Strategic withholding. The covert narcissist controls the emotional temperature of the relationship by controlling access, not through overt anger, but through subtle withdrawal. Shorter responses, a slightly cooler tone, absence at moments when you expected presence. You feel the shift without being able to point to what caused it. You scan your recent behavior for what you might have done. You reach out more. You try harder. You've just demonstrated, without realizing it, that the threat of emotional withdrawal is enough to change your behavior. The silent treatment as punishment. Distinguished from needing space after conflict, the silent treatment as deployed by the covert narcissist is calibrated. It ends when you've adequately demonstrated remorse. It returns when you've done something they object to. The silence is a communication. It says that your behavior is the problem and your job is to fix it. You do fix it repeatedly. The lesson reinforces. Target selection and grooming covert narcissists don't end up with just anyone. There's a selection process, and it runs on psychological logic. The ideal target is high in empathy, conscientious, and prone to self-questioning. Someone who takes responsibility seriously. Someone who, when there's a conflict, automatically examines their own role in it first. Someone who believes that relationships require work and that walking away is a failure. These are not weaknesses. They're genuinely admirable qualities that the covert narcissist identifies and exploits. The grooming phase, the period before the controlling patterns become obvious, is where that empathy gets weaponized. The covert narcissist mirrors you during this period. They reflect your values, your interests, your worldview back at you. You feel profoundly understood. You feel like you've met someone who finally speaks your language. What's actually happening is an assessment. They're learning what you respond to, what you fear, what your needs are, and how to position themselves as the person uniquely suited to meet them. The intimacy you feel is real, but it's one-directional. You're being learned. They're not being known. When the grooming phase ends, and it ends when they're confident enough in your attachment, the person who mirrored you so precisely starts to recede. What remains is someone who knows exactly what you need and has no particular interest in providing it, except when providing it serves a purpose. Cognitive fog. One of the most disorienting effects of sustained covert narcissistic abuse is what researchers studying psychological abuse call cognitive fog, a state in which your ability to trust your own perceptions deteriorates significantly. This doesn't happen through a single dramatic event. It happens through accumulation. You raised a concern and were told your concern was actually an attack. You described what happened and were told your description was inaccurate. You felt something and were told you were overreacting. You noticed a pattern and were told you were too sensitive, too negative, too focused on finding problems. Each individual instance might seem minor. But repeat this pattern across months or years, and something shifts. You stop trusting your read on situations. You start checking your interpretation of events with the narcissist before deciding how you feel about them. You apologize reflexively. You qualify your statements. You preface your experience with, "Maybe I'm wrong, but..." This is called gaslighting in popular usage. The clinical term is reality testing deterioration. What it produces is someone who has outsourced their perception of reality to the person who's been systematically distorting it. At this stage, the relationship is completely asymmetric. One person holds all the interpretive authority. The other asks permission to have their own experiences. The most insidious aspect. You'll often defend this dynamic to people on the outside. You've been trained to see their version of events as more reliable than your own. You've been trained to explain away what others can see clearly from the outside. The fog isn't just disorienting. It isolates. Intermittent reinforcement and why you stay. Psychology has a well-established explanation for why people remain in relationships that cause them demonstrable harm. It's called intermittent reinforcement, and it's the same mechanism that makes gambling addictive. Random reward schedules. Rewards that come unpredictably, not consistently, produce stronger behavioral conditioning than consistent rewards. Your brain doesn't just want the reward. It becomes fixated on the conditions under which the reward appears. It dedicates enormous energy to solving the problem of the reward's unpredictability. In the context of a relationship with a covert narcissist, the reward is the version of them you fell for. The warm, perceptive, vulnerable person from the early period of the relationship. That person still appears. Infrequently, at unpredictable intervals, often right after a period of coldness or conflict. The contrast makes it hit harder. You have evidence that the person you fell in love with is real. You believe the coldness is the aberration. You work to bring the warmth back. This is why people who are objectively intelligent and psychologically aware stay in these relationships far longer than makes logical sense. It's not naivety, it's conditioning. The attachment isn't to the relationship as it consistently is. It's to the relationship as it occasionally is. That occasional reinforcement keeps you working, keeps you hoping, keeps you there. The covert narcissist usually doesn't know they're doing this. They cycle because their own emotional state cycles. But the effect is the same, regardless of awareness. You stay because the variable reward schedule has made, leaving feel like abandoning the possibility of something real. Hoovering. What happens when you try to leave? At some point, some people recognize what's happening and attempt to exit. The covert narcissist's response to this is called hoovering, named after the vacuum, because the behavior is specifically designed to pull you back in. What's notable is how different hoovering looks from the controlling patterns that drove you to leave. The person who returns when you try to leave often looks like the person from the beginning of the relationship. Suddenly emotionally available, suddenly reflective about their behavior, suddenly capable of the vulnerability and warmth that's been absent. They may promise to get therapy. They may acknowledge for the first time that they've hurt you. They may frame the relationship's problems as their own psychological issues. This is exactly what you wanted to hear. It's precisely calibrated to be what you wanted to hear. Some of this acknowledgement may even be genuine in the moment. Covert narcissists experience real distress at the prospect of losing a significant source of narcissistic supply. The attention, admiration, and emotional labor you've been providing. That distress produces real feeling. What it almost never produces is real, sustained change. The hoover works often enough that many people return. Return is followed by a brief period of the better version of the relationship. Then, when the threat of loss has passed and the attachment is resecured, the patterns resume. Sometimes faster than before, because you've now demonstrated that leaving doesn't mean gone. The narcissistic injury. There comes a moment when the mask slips. You catch them in a contradiction that doesn't fit their carefully constructed narrative. You finally hold a boundary they can't manipulate around. You refuse a pity play and name the inconsistency out loud. In that moment, you see something different in them. The warmth drains. What's left is cold, calculating, and visibly contemptuous. This is the narcissistic injury. The moment their sense of superiority takes a direct hit. You've demonstrated that you have your own perception of reality, and you're willing to trust it over their version. That is intolerable to them. The response varies, but the function is the same: punishment. It might come as explosive anger reframed as hurt feelings. It might be weeks of the silent treatment, calibrated to make you retract and apologize. It might be a quiet campaign with mutual contacts, a gradual rewriting of the relationship's history in which you become the unstable one, the one who was always too demanding, too critical, too difficult to love. What's important to understand is that at this stage, the goal shifts. Before the injury, they wanted your compliance. After it, they want you to pay for seeing through them. The mask doesn't just slip in these moments. It comes off, and what's underneath has been there the entire time. Recognition. Here's what makes this recognition genuinely difficult. The person you're dealing with is not performing evil. They're operating from a deep psychological wound, usually a childhood environment that required them to suppress authentic need and construct a false self in order to survive. The mechanisms they're using on you were developed as protective responses long before you existed. This doesn't require your sympathy. It doesn't require you to stay. But it explains why the covert narcissist is often genuinely convincing when they present as a victim. They experience themselves as a victim. Their internal narrative is one of perpetual misunderstanding and chronic mistreatment. The behavior that damages you is, from inside their perception, justified self-protection. This is also why confrontation rarely produces the outcome you want. You're not dealing with someone who secretly knows they're manipulating you and will stop when caught. You're dealing with someone whose entire psychological architecture has been built to prevent them from seeing their own behavior clearly. The recognition that matters isn't getting them to admit it. The recognition that matters is you, seeing the pattern clearly enough to name it, trusting your perception over the narrative that's been installed in you, and understanding that the person who occasionally appeared isn't the person you're actually in a relationship with. The person you're actually in a relationship with is the consistent pattern, not the exception. The exit. Once the pattern is visible, the exit strategy is psychological before it's logistical. You don't try to make them understand what they've done. You don't appeal to something that isn't there. You stop feeding the dynamic emotionally. No dramatic confrontations. No final explanations. Nothing that gives them new material to work with. You rebuild what was quietly dismantled. The connections that were subtly discouraged. The parts of your own judgment you stopped trusting. You move methodically and without announcement. And when you leave completely, not with the hope that they'll finally understand, but with the clear recognition that understanding was never going to come. The covert narcissist counts on your empathy, on your belief that the person you met at the beginning is the real version, and that the patterns that followed were the aberration. That belief is what keeps people inside these relationships years past the point where the evidence is overwhelming. The exit begins when you stop organizing your perception of them around the exception and start looking at what's consistent. The wound you don't see. Relationships with covert narcissists produce a specific kind of damage. It doesn't look like the damage from obviously abusive relationships, which is part of why it goes unaddressed. It looks like low-level depression, chronic self-doubt, a persistent sense that you're failing at something you can't quite identify, a diminished confidence in your own judgment that persists long after the relationship ends. You leave wondering what was wrong with you, why you couldn't make it work, why someone you cared about so deeply could treat you so coldly. You're asking the wrong question. The question isn't what was wrong with you. The question is what was systematically done to your self-perception over an extended period of time. That damage is repairable, but repairing it starts with calling it what it is. The secret narcissist isn't the loudest person in your life. They're the one you've spent the most energy trying to understand. The one you've contorted yourself to accommodate. The one whose suffering you've taken more seriously than your own. The armor they wear isn't arrogance. It's your empathy. And it works because empathy is not a flaw. If this video surfaced something you recognize, the next step isn't more information. It's honest conversation with someone who can help you examine the specific patterns in your specific situation. That conversation is worth having. Subscribe for more psychology content that doesn't soften what the research actually shows.